Derek Voss stood in front of 200 people and laughed at his wife's dream out loud. He didn't know that in exactly 11 days, that same woman would walk into a boardroom, sit at the head of a table he'd never been allowed to see, and decide, with a single word, whether he'd have a job, a house, or a marriage left. He didn't know her name was already printed on the ownership documents of the company he worked for. He didn't know it was printed on 400 others. All he knew, on that night, standing under the gold light of his company's 10th anniversary gala, holding a champagne flute he'd already refilled twice, was that his wife had just said something so small, so laughably small, that he couldn't help himself. "Elena wants to start her own company," he told the table, grinning, waiting for the laugh. "Don't you, honey? Her own little consulting firm." Someone chuckled. His boss smiled politely. Elena sat perfectly still, her hand around a glass of water she hadn't touched. "She reads the Wall Street Journal every morning like she's running something," Derek continued, warming to the bit now, feeding off the attention. "I keep telling her, 'Baby, you sell handmade candles online. Let's keep our feet on the ground.'" The table laughed. Elena smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't reach anywhere close to the eyes. She didn't correct him. She never did, because the truth was so much bigger than anything Derek could have handled at that table in that moment, in that life he thought he understood completely. 3 years earlier, Derek Voss had been a mid-level regional sales manager at a logistics firm called Halstead Freight, driving a leased sedan he couldn't quite afford, chasing a promotion that always seemed to land on someone else's desk. He met Elena Marsh at a friend's engagement party. She was quiet in a room, the kind of quiet that made people lean in rather than look away. She asked good questions. She listened longer than she spoke. When Derek talked about his 5-year plan, regional director, then VP, then maybe his own franchise someday, she nodded and said, "That sounds like a good start." Not amazing. Not, "You'll get there." Just a good start. He should have noticed that, looking back. He didn't. They married a year later in a small ceremony at her request, 20 guests, no press, no fuss, held at a private estate whose owner she never named and whose name never appeared on any invitation. Derek assumed it belonged to a family friend. He never asked who owned it. He never asked much about Elena's past at all, if he was honest with himself. Not her father, who had died when she was 26, not the years right after, which she called complicated and which he never pushed on, not the modest brownstone she'd owned outright before they met, paid for in cash, which he chalked up to old family money and left alone. What Derek did know was this. Elena worked from home. She called it consulting. She took calls in her office with the door shut, always polite about it, always vague about the client. She traveled sometimes, a few days here, a week there, for meetings she described only as boring. She read financial news the way other wives read novels, curled up with a tablet and a coffee, scrolling headlines about mergers and interest rates and quarterly earnings with the quiet attention of someone checking on old friends. Derek found it a little strange. Mostly, he found it beneath his notice. He was the provider in his own mind. He made $81,000 a year, and it felt, to him, like the axis the whole household turned on. Elena's consulting money, whatever it was, filled gaps here and there, a nicer vacation, an unexpected home repair paid without discussion, private school for his niece's tuition covered as a gift that Elena quietly arranged and never mentioned again. He never asked where the money came from. He assumed it came from him, structurally, philosophically, even when the math didn't quite work. That was the conflict at the center of their marriage, long before anyone called it one. Derek believed he was the success story, and Elena let him believe it, because the alternative, the truth, would have changed everything, and she wasn't ready for everything to change. Not yet. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 weeks before the gala. A black car, long, unmarked, driven by a man in a suit who looked more like security than a chauffeur, pulled into their driveway at 6:40 a.m. Derek was on his way out the door with his coffee when he saw Elena walk out in a tailored charcoal suit he'd never seen her wear, her hair pulled back, a leather folio under her arm. "Client meeting," she said, kissing his cheek. "Downtown. I'll be back by 6. In that. He nodded at the car. "They sent it." Don't want to talk about tolls all morning." She smiled and was gone. Derek stood in the driveway a moment longer than he needed to, turning the folio over in his mind. Consulting clients didn't send black cars. Not for a woman who baked sourdough on weekends and sold candles as a hobby business on the side, which was the label he'd assigned to whatever she did and never revised. He mentioned it to his coworker Sal at lunch, mostly as a joke. "My wife got picked up in a town car this morning. Very fancy for a woman who makes candles." Sal laughed. "Maybe she's got a secret life." Derek laughed too. It didn't occur to him, not even for a second, that Sal might be right. That night, Elena came home at 6:15, exactly as promised, and when he asked how the meeting went, she said, "Long, boring. You know how it is," and changed the subject to what they should order for dinner. He let it go. He always let it go, and that, more than anything else, was the reason it took him 3 more years to understand who he'd actually married. 2 weeks after the black car, Derek walked past Elena's office and heard her on the phone, her voice low, controlled, using a tone he didn't recognize. Not warm, not casual. Direct. Final. "No, we're not restructuring the Manila office. I don't care what the board committee thinks is efficient, I care what's right. Table it until I've reviewed the labor numbers myself." The board committee. Derek stood in the hallway, one hand still on the doorframe, and told himself he'd misheard. Elena did freelance consulting. She advised small businesses. Maybe she was quoting a client. Maybe it was a joke she was rehearsing. There were 100 explanations, and he reached for the most convenient one, the way he always did, and knocked on the door. She opened it a crack, phone still to her ear, and mouthed 5 minutes, then shut it again, gently but firmly. He waited in the kitchen, unsettled in a way he couldn't name. When she came out, 20 minutes later, not 5, she was smiling ordinary herself again. "Sorry. Client emergency. You know how these business owners get, they think every hiccup is a 5-alarm fire." Sounded serious, Derek said, watching her carefully now for the first time in a long time. "It's always serious to them," Elena said. "That's the job. Making other people's fires feel smaller than they are." It was, Derek would later realize, one of the truest things she ever said to him. He simply didn't understand, at the time, whose fires she was actually putting out. The gala where Derek made his joke was the turning point, not because Elena reacted, but because of who was in the room. Marcus Webb, a tall, silver-haired man in his 50s whom Derek had never met, approached their table late in the evening. He wore a suit that cost more than Derek's car, and he crossed the room with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once worried about being interrupted. He stopped in front of Elena and extended a hand. "Chairwoman," he said, "I didn't expect to see you here tonight. I hope I'm not intruding." Derek blinked. "Chairwoman." He assumed, for one absurd second, that the man had confused Elena with someone else, some corporate wife with a ceremonial board seat at a charity gala, the kind of thing rich men's spouses collected like hobbies. Elena stood, shook the man's hand, and said, evenly, "Marcus, this isn't the place." Her voice carried a warning Derek had never heard her use before. Not with him. Not with anyone. Marcus Webb's eyes flicked to Derek, taking him in. The cheap tuxedo rental, the third glass of champagne, the easy grin still lingering from his joke about candles, and something crossed his face that Derek, even in his self-satisfaction, recognized as pity. "Of course," Marcus said smoothly. "Forgive the intrusion. We'll speak Monday." He gave a small bow, an actual, old-world bow, barely perceptible but unmistakable, and walked away. Derek turned to Elena. "Who was that? And why did he call you chairwoman?" "Client," Elena said too quickly. "He gets carried away with titles. Ignore him." Derek let it go, because the champagne had made the whole night soft and pleasant, and because he genuinely, truly believed there was no version of reality large enough to contain a truth bigger than the one he'd already assigned to his wife. He believed his life was simple. He believed he understood the shape of it completely. He was wrong on both counts, and the world was about to show him exactly how wrong, one carefully controlled reveal at a time. Monday came, and with it, a phone call Derek would remember for the rest of his life. Not because of what was said, but because of the silence that followed it. He was at his desk at Halstead Freight when his direct supervisor, a nervous man named Phil Grissom, called an all-hands meeting for 2 o'clock. No agenda was given. No explanation offered. Just, mandatory, all staff, conference room B. By 1:45, rumors were already moving through the building like static electricity. Someone had heard the words acquisition. Someone else swore they'd seen unfamiliar lawyers in the executive suite that morning, carrying bankers' boxes instead of briefcases. Sal leaned over Derek's cubicle wall, face pale. "Dude, I think we're getting bought." "By who?" Derek asked, already feeling something cold settle in his stomach. "Nobody knows. Some holding company. Solace something." Derek had never heard the name. He filed it away as unimportant, the way he filed away most things that didn't immediately concern him, and walked into conference room B at 2 o'clock with the rest of the staff, expecting reassurance. He did not get reassurance. The CEO of Halstead Freight, a heavy-set man named Bill Halstead who had run the company since Derek was in college, stood at the front of the room looking like he'd aged 5 years overnight. "As some of you have heard," Bill said, "Halstead Freight has entered into acquisition talks with Solace Holdings. I want to be direct with you. This is not a rumor. The offer is real, and the board is currently negotiating terms." The room erupted in murmurs. Derek's hand went cold around his coffee cup. "What happens to us?" someone called out. "That," Bill said, "depends entirely on what the new ownership decides. I won't lie to you. Solace has a reputation for aggressive restructuring. Some of you may keep your positions. Some of you may not. I wish I had more to tell you." Derek sat frozen in his chair, running numbers in his head that had nothing to do with logistics. The mortgage, the car lease, the credit card balance he had mentioned to Elena, the promotion he'd been chasing for 2 years that now might not exist at all in 6 weeks. He didn't think, not once, in that entire meeting, to wonder why the name Solace Holdings made something flicker at the very edge of his memory, like a word he'd heard once and forgotten on purpose. He didn't think of the black car. He didn't think of the phone call about the Manila office. He didn't think of Marcus Webb's bow. He would, though. Soon. And when he did, the memory would arrive all at once, like a wall collapsing. The days that followed the announcement were the worst of Derek's professional life. Every conversation in the building carried an undertone of dread. People started quietly updating resumes at their desks, not bothering to hide the browser tabs anymore. Phil Grissom stopped making eye contact entirely. Rumors about Solace Holdings multiplied, that it was run by a reclusive board, that its ownership structure was so opaque that even industry journalists couldn't pin down who actually controlled it, that it had swallowed 6 companies in the past 2 years and gutted half of them down to skeleton crews. Derek came home each night more anxious than the last, and each night, Elena listened to him talk about it with a calm, careful patience that, had he been paying closer attention, should have struck him as strange. She never seemed shocked by any detail he shared. She never asked the follow-up questions a stranger to the situation would naturally ask. She simply listened, nodded, and said things like, "It'll work out the way it's supposed to," in a tone that carried more certainty than comfort usually does. "You don't understand," Derek said one night, 3 days before the board's decision was expected. "This isn't just my job. If Solace guts middle management the way they did at Renwick Systems, I'm gone. We're gone. The house, everything." "I understand more than you think," Elena said quietly. He didn't hear it. He was too far inside his own fear to hear anything that didn't sound like reassurance, shaped exactly like the reassurance he wanted. The next morning, a courier arrived at their house. Not the black car this time, but a formal envelope, cream-colored, sealed with a wax stamp Derek had never seen before, a stylized S inside a circle. Elena took it at the door, thanked the courier by name, and carried it to her office without a word. Derek followed her halfway down the hall. "What is that?" "Paperwork," she said. "Nothing that concerns you." "Everything concerns me right now, Elena. My entire job is hanging on some decision being made by people I've never met for a company I don't even understand." She turned to look at him then, and for the briefest moment, something passed behind her eyes. Not guilt exactly, but the weight of a decision she'd been putting off for 3 years, finally arriving at its deadline. "You'll understand soon," she said. "I promise you that." She shut the office door, and Derek stood in the hallway a long time, staring at the space where the cream envelope had disappeared, feeling, for the first time in his life, genuinely afraid of his own wife's calm. The board meeting that decided the fate of Halstead Freight was scheduled for a Thursday morning at the Solace Holdings headquarters downtown, a glass tower Derek had passed 100 times without ever once looking up at it. Bill Halstead had personally requested that a handful of senior staff attend, Derek among them, as a show of good faith and institutional continuity. Derek spent the morning rehearsing what he might say if given 30 seconds in front of the new owners. Some version of "I've given 11 years to this company, please don't erase me." His stomach in knots the entire elevator ride to the 40th floor. The conference room they were led into was larger than his entire department at Halstead. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A long obsidian table. Name placards already set for the incoming board. Derek sat near the end, close enough to see, far enough to be forgotten, exactly the way he'd spent most of his career. At 9:58, the double doors opened, and Marcus Webb walked in first, followed by two attorneys, followed by a woman in a slate-gray suit whose hair was pulled back the way it had been the morning of the black car. Derek's stomach dropped before his mind caught up to what his eyes were seeing. Elena walked to the head of the table, not a seat near it, the head of it, and sat down as every single person in that room, Solace executives included, rose slightly from their chairs in quiet, practiced deference. "Good morning," she said, in the voice Derek had heard once through a closed office door, and never again. "Let's begin." Bill Halstead, to Derek's shock, did not look surprised. He looked relieved, the way a man looks when he's finally allowed to stop bracing for a blow. He'd clearly known. He'd probably known for years, quietly, the way certain people in certain rooms simply know things and are paid, in part, to never say them out loud. Derek sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, watching his wife open a leather folio, the same one from the black car, months ago, and begin walking the room through the terms of the acquisition with the fluency of someone who had built the deal from its very first draft. "Solace Holdings," Elena said, "will retain 90% of Halstead Freight's current workforce. I've reviewed the labor impact assessment personally, and I was not satisfied with the initial restructuring plan submitted by the transition team. It was too aggressive, and frankly, it was lazy. People built this company. People will keep running it." Marcus Webb nodded, unsurprised, the way a man nods when he's heard his boss say something he's heard her say 100 times before. Derek finally found his voice, barely above a whisper, to the man sitting beside him. Is she? "Chairwoman of Solace Holdings," the man murmured back, glancing at him strangely. "You didn't know? She's the majority shareholder. Been running the whole portfolio since her father passed. 200 billion, give or take. You work for her, technically. Everyone in this room works for her." The number didn't register at first. It was too large, too abstract, a figure Derek had only ever seen attached to countries, not people, and certainly never attached to the woman who bought store-brand pasta and complained about the price of gas. Elena's eyes lifted from her folio and found Derek's across the table, not cruel, not triumphant, just steady, the way she'd always looked at him, except now he finally understood what that steadiness had been holding back the entire time. "Derek," she said, gently, in front of the entire board, in front of Bill Halstead, in front of Marcus Webb and the attorneys and every person whose job now depended on a decision she alone had the power to make. "Would you like to say anything before we finalize terms?" The room turned to look at him. Derek Voss, who had laughed at her dream in front of 200 people 6 weeks earlier, who had told her, more than once, over more than one dinner, that her reading of the financial section was cute but not exactly practical, who had introduced her at parties as "my wife, she does the candle thing," opened his mouth and found that for the first time in his adult life, he had absolutely nothing to say. The truth, once Derek finally learned all of it, took him weeks to fully absorb. Elena's father, Richard Marsh, had built Solace Holdings from a single regional insurance firm into a $200 billion conglomerate spanning logistics, manufacturing, insurance, and real estate across 4 continents. When he died suddenly of a heart attack, Elena, 26 years old, barely out of graduate school, inherited controlling interest in the entire portfolio, along with a boardroom full of executives who assumed a young woman would sell her shares within a year and disappear. She hadn't disappeared. She'd simply gone quiet. She'd hired Marcus Webb as her public-facing CEO and operated almost entirely behind him, studying every division of the company personally, correcting mistakes her father's old guard had been too comfortable to fix, protecting jobs that other conglomerates would have cut without a second thought. She'd built a private life deliberately separate from her public one, not out of shame, but out of a hard, early lesson. Money changed how people looked at her, how they spoke to her, what they wanted from her. After her father's death, she'd been surrounded by relatives, friends, and suitors who suddenly discovered a deep and passionate interest in her well-being the moment they learned what she was worth. She wanted, just once in her life, to be loved for exactly who she was without the number attached to her name doing the talking. So when she met Derek, ordinary, unimpressed by the little he knew, uninterested in her past because he simply never asked, she let herself believe, for a while, that she'd finally found it. What she hadn't accounted for was what happens to a man's character when he believes, with total confidence, that he is the most important person in the room. Derek hadn't fallen in love with a mystery. He'd fallen in love with the story he told himself about his own importance, and Elena's silence had simply given that story room to grow, unchallenged, for 3 years. In the weeks after the board meeting, Halstead Freight staff kept their jobs, exactly as Elena had promised. Bill Halstead stayed on as division president under the new ownership. Derek did not lose his position. Elena made certain of that, not as a gift to him, but because she refused to let 90 innocent employees suffer for one man's misjudgment of his own wife. But something else was lost, quietly, in that boardroom, and it never fully came back. Derek moved out 6 weeks later, not because Elena asked him to, but because he couldn't stand to sit across from her at dinner every night, aware now of everything he hadn't seen, everything he dismissed, every small cruelty he delivered with a laugh, while the woman across the table controlled more wealth than entire nations. Some men might have stayed for the money. Derek left because, for the first time in his life, he finally understood what he'd actually been standing next to and how small he had made himself, by making her small first. Elena never spoke about the marriage publicly, never let a headline near it, never once used her position to punish him beyond the truth, simply becoming visible. She didn't need to punish him. The truth did that on its own. Years later, when young analysts at Solace Holdings asked her, carefully, respectfully, why she'd waited so long to reveal who she really was to the people closest to her, she gave the same answer every time, quiet and certain. The answer that closed every version of this story before it began again with someone new. I never hid my worth, she'd say. I only waited to see who could recognize it without being told.